Thank you so much, everybody, for being here this evening. Welcome to the latest edition of Birds and Bytes and the latest program in our Year of the Nighthawk celebrations. Really excited to have you with us here this evening, and really excited to have um, an expert in the field who I have been a fanboy of since the Twitter days. We were just talking about Twitter and how it was such a great bird network to learn about all the folks doing bird work. So I'm glad that we could reconnect here and have Elly Knight present for us here this evening. Of course, this is a Chicago Ornithological Society program. So if you're not already familiar with us as an organization or not already a member, well, why the heck not? It's one of the cheapest memberships out there, and you get to support awesome programs like this. And especially, you get to support things like the Chicago Nighthawk Project, which is our own homegrown and developed citizen science project to study and monitor nighthawks across the Chicagoland area. This project has now in its fifth year. Hooray! Which is why this is our big celebration year, celebrating Nighthawks in all of its forms and shapes and types. So thank you again for joining us this evening. If you'd like to learn more about that project and even better, volunteer, we're actively recruiting volunteers for our Nighthawk project to go out and monitor this summer. Please check out our website. I'll drop a link in the chat. Would love to see you out there and have you join us in our collective study and joy of common nighthawks. But anyway, you didn't come here to listen to me talk all night. I will go ahead and now turn it over to Elly Knight to present for you this evening here. Take it away, Elly.
Okay, thanks, Edward. You can hear me? You can see my screen okay? I think we're good to go. Um, well, thanks everyone for joining. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my work working on common nighthawks. It's pretty exciting to hear that you guys are having a full year of nighthawks. It's obviously my favorite bird. So let's jump right into sort of the roadmap for today. What are we going to talk about? First, we're gonna start pretty basic. Probably everyone knows some of the answers to some of the early content on the talk, but we're gonna talk about what is a nightjar. Then we're going to talk about the nighthawk specifically, meet the common nighthawk. We're going to talk a little bit about conservation status of the common nighthawk. Then we're going to talk about knowledge gaps and some of the objectives of the research that I've done. So the work that I'm presenting today is a lot of the migration tracking work that I've done that leads into some of the conservation implications for this species. So we're going to talk about space use, where do nighthawks go, how much space do they take up. We're going to talk about habitat selection, what kinds of environments nighthawks like to live in across the full annual cycle. Talk a little bit about migratory connectivity, how well they stay together across the annual cycle. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the drivers of population trends that we've seen from some of the preliminary results out of this work. Then we're going to talk a little bit, bring it back to citizen science at the end and talk about how all of these pieces fit together and how you can contribute to common nighthawk conservation. And then we'll have a couple of conclusions. And so the talk today is probably about 40 minutes long, and I'm going to try and sort of pepper some questions in here and there, maybe get some feedback from folks. So if you're open to it, feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat if I ask a question. So nightjars and me, who am I? Why am I talking about nighthawks? I was a program manager for the Wild Research Nightjar Survey from 2010 to 2020. So this is Canada's nightjar monitoring community science program that I helped found and get launched, and which is now run by Birds Canada, which we'll talk about a little bit at the end. And then I also did my PhD on common nighthawks from 2015 to 2021. So I worked a lot with migration tracking data that we're going to look at today. I also worked a lot with acoustic monitoring data and sort of machine learning classification of sounds of nighthawks and behavior and habitat use in the boreal forest. I'm also a founding member of the Global Nightjar Network, which I'll show you a little bit of at the end, which is a global community for folks who study nightjars or who just are nightjar enthusiasts. And so I know some about nightjars, but I know a lot about nighthawks. Unfortunately, you'll notice the last date on this slide is 2021. I unfortunately don't get to work directly with nighthawks anymore. I work more with a larger suite of birds, but they still remain my favorite species, and I still am working on some of the science pieces that we're going to look at today, sort of off the side of my desk as I continue to work on them, because there's actually just so much to learn and know about nighthawks. Okay, so probably the first thing that we'll start with is that nighthawks are not a hawk. This is probably not a surprise to anyone in the room, but I thought, we'll just start. We'll start at ground zero. Not a hawk. Does anyone know what family nighthawks are a part of? You can throw it in the chat if you want. Anyone? So that well, I kind of gave it away already. Um, Nighthawks are a nightjar. And so the family name for the nightjars is Caprimulgidae. This is a phylogenetic tree of all of the birds, or at least one version of it. But what's kind of cool about the nightjars, and you see this on this version of the phylogenetic tree, as well as lots of others, sort of the genetic structure of the birds, is that nightjars are way down here at the bottom. This is sort of the chronology of time in this circle. Can you see my pointer, by the way? Yeah. And so there's sort of these longer segments of the phylogenetic tree show that these are the older birds. And so there's one of the genetic papers that says that the nightjars are a very old and successful body design, which I just think is a lovely way of thinking about this rather unusual group of birds to which the nightjars belong. So this is actually, an extremely well-distributed family of birds. So there's nightjars all across the world, except for, some of the polar regions. And there's a whole bunch of different clades. And so here in North America, we have two different clades. We have the nighthawk clade, which we're going to talk about today. And then we also have the poorwill clade, which is the whippoorwills and the chuckles widows and all those guys. Okay, so here I'm going to ask you, so what makes a nightjar? Does anyone want to throw out some nightjar attributes? When you think of nightjars, what do you think of? They come out at night. Yes. Muppet mouth, active at night. Yes. Store things in jars. Maybe not. Large eyes. Yes. Erratic flying. Ooh, nice one. Okay. Great answers. I like the store things in jars. We'll get to why they can't store things in jars. Eat bugs. Yes. Insectivores. Yes. Okay. Let's run through a bunch of nightjar attributes. Okay, so nocturnal or crepuscular, check. You just got that. Acoustic communicators, no one said that one, but that one's really important and is obviously directly tied to their nocturnal life history. It's way easier to communicate with sound when it's dark out than by communicating visually. Cryptic plumage, so they're super camouflaged. You can probably see it, but there is a female nighthawk right here in the photo. Okay, so those are the ones that I think of first. The next one is insectivores. So I think this is a fun video. Aerial insectivores specifically. This is a ball of food that I pulled out of a nighthawk's mouth that I caught. So this is what nighthawks were eating in a post-burn area of the boreal forest in 2017, maybe. Anyway, I'm going to play the video because I think it's kind of cool. Anyway, so these are longhorn beetles that this particular male nighthawk has caught in midair, but they're actually still alive. And you can see he's been holding them in his mouth. And he's got all this gooey saliva that kind of keeps this bolus of food together. But I just think it's wild. These, like you said, these Muppet mouths that can collect all these bugs and then just have them alive in your mouth and then bring them back for your babies. I don't know. That's a wild thing to do. Okay, what else makes a nightjar? Large eyes. Ding, ding, ding. They also have this special reflective layer at the back of the retina, which helps improve their vision at night. All of them have these prominent rictal bristles, which the nighthawks have less of, but that poorwill clade and a lot of the true nightjars really have these strong, fun whiskers, which are probably for improving foraging success. And then they have this tiny bill and then that huge Muppet mouth. What makes a nightjar? Well, this is why they can't store things in jars. They have tiny legs with weak feet and they would never be able to get the jars open. But yeah, they all have these tiny little legs. Sometimes when they walk, they look a little bit like they're floating. Another interesting one, they all have this comb on the middle toe. It's called a pectinate claw, and you can see the picture of it here. It's presumably for breeding. This is actually a feature that there's a fair bit of convergent evolution around in some of the birds. I think the herons and the parrots also have pectinate claws, but it, they have all evolved through different ways. So kind of a cool one. Um, they also all have these big white patches for mating display, and that's probably associated with their nocturnal nature. If you can keep a flashy white patch in good shape, the feathers have less structure because they don't have as much melanin in them as the black feathers. So, being able to keep your white feathers, your flashy white feathers, in good shape through the breeding season is presumably a sign of being a strong and good nighthawk. Um, And then they all lay eggs on bare ground. So the nighthawks, none of them make nests. They make what's called a scrape, which I think is kind of a generous description, although you can kind of see in this photo here. I mean, someone has, whoops, here's my cursor. Someone, clearly the bird has taken some time to move some of the pine needles out of the way, but it's really mostly just eggs on the ground. And then they all have these semi-precocial young that are born, they're pretty downy when they're born, but they can get up and follow mom away from danger, even, within the first day or so. So they're sort of somewhere between a duck or a shorebird that like pops out of the egg and hops in the water, and an extremely altricial songbird that is born just like naked and absolutely helpless. Okay, so, like I said, there's these two subfamilies in North America, or clades, what we call them. So there's the Porwell clade. There's 7 species. These are the ones that are truly nocturnal. These are the sally feeders, where they sort of come up from a perch and they catch their flying insects and then they fly back down. They have those more prominent rectal bristles, longer bills, softer plumage, apparently, and they have shorter, rounder wings. The nighthawk clade, which we're going to be talking about today, there are 3 species in North America. So there's the common nighthawk, which we'll talk about. There's also the lesser nighthawk, and then of course there's the Antillean nighthawk. And this clade is a little bit more crepuscular, so we're a little bit more dawn and dusk now, and not truly nocturnal. And they've got that erratic flight that I think Rachel mentioned. They're continuous flight feeders, so they're a lot like a swallow. They're feeding on the wing. They have smaller icter bristles, shorter bills. I guess it's implied that they have less soft plumage. And then they do have those long pointed wings that are probably partially for that continuous flight foraging strategy, but probably also because and we'll see today, they migrate farther. And so there's our nighthawk. And so we're here on that phylogenetic tree, and this is what all of those other nighthawk species look like. So there are 6 species in this Cordalis genus. And one of the things that I really like, I think that when Rachel said erratic flying, that the name Cordalis actually means evening dancer, and I think that's such a lovely description of that erratic flight that they do at dusk. Anna asks, when they're talking about soft plumage, how soft are they? Well, I don't know. I've never caught any birds from the Porwell clade, but I can certainly say that the nighthawks are quite soft and like really dense feathers too. If you have sweaty hands and you handle a nighthawk, you end up with body feathers all over your hands. So I don't know. I can only imagine how much softer a Porwell would be, but maybe one day I'll get to hold one. So Cordalis minor, common nighthawk, has an extremely large breeding range. So this is a very cosmopolitan species. They breed in habitats all across the Western Hemisphere, from the Pine Barrens down in Florida to they'll breed in bogs and sandy post-fire areas in the northern boreal forests. They will breed on rocky bluffs on the coast of Vancouver Island and in the Gulf Islands. Grasslands and the prairies, like they're just really anywhere that they can put 2 eggs on bare ground. It seems to be kind of their habitat requirements. And because they're so mobile, they're very opportunistic with their diet. Really, what, at least from some of the work that we've done in the boreal forest, it seems to be what's driving their habitat relationships is that ability to find bare ground and put their eggs down. And then because they can move so much, and we'll look in the migration tracking work a little bit later on, just like how mobile they are. They seem to kind of just go wherever the food is. And, I mean, I'm sure folks who have seen them, sometimes you see a whole bunch. They find a good foraging spot. They will often forage together, even though they're quite territorial in terms of their nesting territory. So typically they lay 2 eggs. Usually they only have one brood if it's successful. Sometimes they will relay if their nest is depredated, but usually it's just 2 eggs per year. And raising baby nighthawks is a fair bit of work. It takes 20 plus days to hatch an egg, and then another 20 to 30 to raise the fledglings to independence. So it's definitely a bit more of an investment than it is for a songbird, and that's probably why they have a slightly slower life history, and they only have the 2 eggs per year. And then they have the 2 sounds. They have the vocal peat, and then they also have that mechanical wing boom. So essentially, what the wing boom is, for those who haven't seen it, they fly up high, and then the males undertake this sort of steep aerial dive. And at the bottom of that dive, they actually bend their wingtips down. And as the wind rushes through those wingtips, the wingtips vibrate, and it makes this booming sound that travels really far. And that's actually a territorial display that we've shown is associated with the nest location. So you can use it to differentiate places where nighthawks are nesting from places where they're just kind of hanging out and foraging. So the thing about nighthawks, they're super opportunistic. They have this massive breeding range, but they are declining and seem to have been declining for quite some time. So the declines are less steep than they were, 5-10 years ago, but we're still seeing declines across the entire range of the species. Obviously, it's patchy, so this is results from the breeding bird survey, which again is not the best way of monitoring the species, but is still probably giving us reliable signals of population trend. And so you can see there's a fair bit of red on the map. And yeah, we're in the sort of negative numbers for both Canada, United States, and then all of North America combined. Because this is such a broadly distributed species, it's one of the largest breeding ranges in the Western Hemisphere. They are considered least concern under IUCN, but they are listed in Canada as special concern. They were previously listed as threatened and have been downlisted to special concern because there's actually a lot more in the boreal forest than we originally thought. And then they have been listed as imperiled in several eastern United States as well. So there's certainly impetus to try and understand why the species is declining. I think it's a pretty iconic species. A lot of people really strongly associate nighthawks with like warm summer nights, and I think is a species that a lot of people have an emotional attachment to. So there's some motivation there to try and understand the drivers of population declines. And so, some of the reasons that folks think the species is declining is that they're part of this group called the aerial insectivores, which a couple of folks mentioned in the chat. Trina and Karen said insectivores. And there's, at least in Canada, but also I think the same has been shown in the US in terms of these state of the birds reporting, the aerial insectivores are declining more than any other bird group. And there's lots of potential reasons why we think that might happen. The first is phenological mismatch. They're eating these aerial insects, and a lot of these species are migrating from really far away. So maybe with changing climate, the insects are hatching earlier and emerging earlier, but nighthawks and other aerial insectivores are missing the peak timing of that food source for breeding. And so you're getting this mismatch that drives lower productivity and population declines. Potential wetland loss, aerial insects, a lot of these emergent insects, especially in more arid landscapes, are coming off of wetlands. Pesticide application, it could be light pollution is making foraging harder, increased weather extremes for long distance migrants. It's kind of a long, very long potential list. I mean, I think we see this list for a lot of bird species. Could be habitat loss, could be vehicle collisions, climate change, pollution, predation. But yeah, it's a long list. And so it's hard to, I think, especially for species for which we don't know a lot about, it can be hard to disentangle some of these things, and especially for highly migratory species. So we're gonna try and take take a stab at it, at understanding, even for a species that lives in lots of different places at lots of different times of the year. We're going to try and take a stab at disentangling a little bit of that today. Okay, so nighthawks are admittedly, they're called the most studied nightjar in North America, but there's still many gaps. So this is actually just like a photo out of a textbook that I have. But I think it does a really nice job of demonstrating like we don't really know that much even about where this species goes in other stages of the annual cycle outside of the breeding grounds here in North America. This is a range map with a bunch of question marks on it. And so that's the focus of the science that I'm going to show today, is sort of filling in some of those gaps. So here in Canada, when we list a species as threatened or a special concern, we undertake a recovery process for that species, and that includes a recovery strategy. And I think there's an assessment and there's a recovery strategy. And so these are some of the gaps that were identified in the 2016 recovery strategy for the species. Migratory connectivity, so like where are they going and how well connected are populations staying across the annual cycle? Best way to monitor them, and what kind of habitats do they like? Can anyone take a stab at why we don't know anything very much about nighthawks? Like, even though they're our most studied species, does anyone have any guesses as to why they're so hard to study? I have three. There are three main reasons that I think. Active at night, yes. Nocturnal. It's way harder to get people to go out at night to look for nighthawks. They're elusive, yes. Yeah. So and elusive, that's such a great adjective, because I think it actually encapsulates like the other two on my list, which is far ranging. Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. I don't have that one on here. Elusive, I think, combines that cryptic piece and the mobile piece. Like, not only are they hard to find on the ground and to nest search because of that camouflage, exactly, Rachel, but they're also super mobile and they're really hard to track. And then, yeah, far ranging is a good point. Like, it is actually harder, I think, because they have such a wide breeding range and because they're so cosmopolitan in all the different places that they live, that it can be hard to elucidate patterns across the species. But I think we're learning. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Okay, so the objectives for the set of research that I'm going to show today are, they put themselves in spots that are difficult for us to access. Yes, that's also true. Yeah, there's some that will nest in the middle of bogs up in the north. Like, they can be really hard. They can be really hard to get to. Anyway, okay, so research objectives. So the first was just to figure out, to fill in the question marks on that range map. Like, where are they going? Where are they spending their time, during migration and in the non-breeding or the wintering season? And then the second was to then understand, well, what types of environments? What is their habitat selection across that annual cycle? We can at the same time describe their migratory connectivity. So how well are groups staying together across the annual cycle? And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important. And then we can put those two things together to correlate their habitat use across the annual cycle with population monitoring from the breeding grounds. Okay, but to do that, because they're so far ranging, they're so mobile, they go to inconvenient places, we have to track them. And there's some pretty substantial obstacles to tracking a nighthawk, because a nighthawk weighs anywhere between 55 and 100 grams. The first is weight. So obviously, it's really easy to put a tracking collar on a bison. It's way harder to put a tracking device on a bird that is that small. The second is accuracy. So even devices there are really small devices that can be put on songbirds, but they typically don't allow for enough accuracy to really understand like the types of habitats that individuals and a species are using. And then the third is getting them back. So especially for species that, spoiler alert, can have 100 square kilometer home range, you may put a tag out on it, in 1 year, and then come back and try and catch it the next year. And it's just almost impossible. And we did, in fact, try. So we put out about 100 of these things, somewhere in the 90s. This is an Argos GPS tag on common nighthawks between 2017 and 2018. And at a whole bunch of locations across Canada and the US, and we all tried to get them back, and we got 3 back. So the reason that we have data that I can share with you today is because these are kind of an interesting tag. It's an Argos GPS tag where it's collecting high precision GPS points, probably a 10 to 20 meter accuracy. But then it's, once or twice a day, the tag actually sort of like powers up and screens at the sky for a while, and it tries to upload data to the Argos satellite, as opposed to just storing it on board and then requiring recapture of the individual. So we were actually able to get a decent amount of tracking data for this species by using these tags that upload. So we put them on adult males and females. We put them at 13 locations across the breeding range. So you can see these are the white dots on the map here. Put them all the way from the Yukon and the Northwest Territories in the north, down to Arizona, and we've got some here from the Texas Gulf Coast. I tried putting them out in Florida, but the Nighthawks in Florida are so small that they were too small to carry the tags. So I caught some Nighthawks in Florida, but I did not get to put any tags on them in Florida. And so then we also put tags across a gradient of population trends so that we could try and understand what are the environmental attributes of populations that are increasing and populations that are decreasing, and how do those differ, and maybe start to understand what drives population trend. So before I show you some of the data from those tags, I want you to meet Maurice. So if anyone's wondering how you catch a nighthawk, it's with Maurice. Maurice is really, really, really key to catching nighthawk. And I'm going to show you how that works. It's a video called Maurice Catches a Nighthawk. Edward, can you hear the audio for it?
I don't think so, no.
No, okay. Well, that's okay. It's not mission critical. I'll just talk over it anyway. So this is a mist net. This is how we catch birds. It's a 2-panel. The really key part of catching nighthawk, and this is Janet, who invented Maurice, you have to put Maurice in the net. So nighthawks, they have those big eyes. We can't hear Maurice's voice. I know, so sad. There is actually a playback as well. So you put Maurice in the net, and then you put a recording of a nighthawk calling. So it essentially makes this territorial male, who you can now see flying around the mist net apparatus, think that there is this incredibly handsome competitor in his breeding territory. And Maurice is particularly handsome because he has that big white chest patch and those big white wing patches. And this is where these males are actually really aggressive from a territorial perspective. Eventually, he can see the net, like you can see it, but he eventually gets so angry that he makes a mistake and lands in the net. And so that's how you catch a nighthawk. Why is his name Maurice? I don't know. You'd have to ask Janet. I think probably because it's a good name. He's a good nighthawk. Anyway, Maurice is very effective. If you try and catch a nighthawk without Maurice, you will not catch the nighthawk. Actually, I've had males knock Maurice out of the net because they were so enraged about how handsome he was. The tags that we put out were great, but they weren't perfect. So the thing about trying to transmit to a satellite is it doesn't always work, especially when you're on the wintering grounds in dense vegetation. So there's the number. Of the 85 tags we put out, 54 of them reported data back, but you can see it's kind of patchy. Like there's this whole section here where we didn't really hear from them during winter or spring migration. And, some of them up here, we didn't get much data. As soon as there's a Maurice reference in the classic Steve, I don't know. I'll have to ask Janet. The good news is that we did get data from all locations except our Quebec population. But the bad news is that sampling is inconsistent. So we had to deal with that analytically in the work that we did next. Afterwards, this is a video that the Smithsonian Institute put together, the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center put together, that shows those tracks from the data I just showed you, and shows sort of how all the nighthawks come together and migrate together onto the winter grounds and then come back in the spring. let's talk about some cool migration facts. So we actually learned a fair bit from this data, just about there were actually just some misconceptions on how nighthawks migrated and what they did. And so we learned some cool things. The first is that from what we can tell, nighthawks don't use the Pacific Flyway. So they're not coming down the coast of the Pacific at all. What they're doing instead is they're all gathering at the Mississippi Flyway. And this is why you see huge amounts of nighthawks migrating through the sort of Great Lakes area, especially in the fall. So we actually had one individual that nested on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and he literally flew 3,000 kilometers due east over the Rockies before turning south and heading down the Mississippi Flyway. So they all do this, like they all come east and then they meet together and then they come down the Mississippi Flyway. And that was super cool. And there's actually increasing evidence that they're not the only species to do this either. So that was pretty neat. The next one was that nearly all individuals cross the Gulf of Mexico. So they're not taking the short route, or they're not taking the easy route over land through Central America. They're all crossing the Gulf. Probably because they're so aerial and it's migration is easier for them. But the pre-breeding migration in particular, so this would be spring migration. We had one individual who was tracked with a higher resolution tag, so it was taking points every day, and he flew 3 days nonstop, 5,000 kilometers in total. So he basically took off from Colombia and then just kept going when he hit the coast. So I mean, he just kept going. And there's evidence from the larger tracking data set that it wasn't the only individual to do that. So these birds are extremely good at flying. The flight speed is probably about 40 kilometers an hour, but that one individual, it was, he hit 100 kilometers an hour with tailwinds coming off of the Gulf during that spring migration. And so the round trip, especially for some individuals that are breeding up in the Yukon and the Northwest Territories at the northern edge of the range, it can be like 20,000 kilometers. So again, it really speaks to the mobility of the species. Okay, I'm gonna maybe speed up a little bit because we're already at 10 after. And the other cool thing we found is that most birds don't really appear to do stopovers. They're more of a like what is called a fly and forage migrant, where they'll kind of slow down in areas where probably there's better food availability, but they don't really seem to stop and land anywhere for any given day. There is some evidence from work where birds were tagged on the wintering grounds and then tracked throughout the season, that at least for this population, there is some stopover that might be a molt stopover. It's quite long, like it's 2 to 10 weeks. So it might be an indication that birds are stopping and molting, but we didn't see any evidence of that in the larger data set that we did. But again, there's probably a fair bit of population specific variation in the migration behavior, given how widely distributed the species is. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about space use. So one of the cool things we learned is that home range area really varies strongly across the seasons. So the A panel here is just a histogram of sort of the size of a home range. And we've got breeding, we've got wintering, and then we've got migration here. And then this is an example of what a home range looks like with the sort of probability distribution overlaid on satellite imagery here. So the average home range during the breeding season was about 70 square kilometers, with some individuals having home ranges of over 100 square kilometers. But during the wintering season, it's like really quite small. So they stay quite local, only 2 kilometers. And then these sort of like migration stopovers or like slowdown areas can be really, really quite large. So, this is a few days of an individual staying in the same area, but it's a 10,000 square kilometer area. So again, speaking to how big it is. Does no stopovers mean if we see them here in Chicago, they're here to stay, not just passing through? I mean, I think it depends on whether you see them day after day. It could be multiple individuals passing through, and so it seems like it's the same individual. I think time of year is probably a better determinant of whether they're breeding or passing through. So if it's, anywhere in Chicago, you're probably looking at anywhere from like late May to late July being your breeding season, early August, and then anything outside of that would probably be migration. And they do vocalize some on migration, but much more during during the breeding season. Again, there may be some chance that they could do a wing boom outside of the breeding season, but it is pretty strongly indicative of that of nesting territory. So that wing boom is a good indication of breeding habitat use for sure. Yeah, so we're using these areas from defining space use to define habitat selection. And I'm going to run through this one really quickly. So basically, we used the size of these home ranges to compare points that nighthawks were using to points where, maybe they could have gone, but they decided not to. So this is sort of how we define habitat selection when we analyze this data. And then you can compare it between seasons. And essentially what we saw is that the type of environment that a nighthawk uses really depends on what season they're in. So in the breeding season, that's the yellow here. They're using open areas during the breeding season. So EVI is enhanced vegetation index. It's essentially a measure of greenness. And so what this is telling us is that nighthawks don't like green areas and they don't like treed areas during the breeding season. There's a couple others. They really don't like crop areas. They also don't really like water. And then they do seem to like artificial light at night, which is what ALAN stands for. And so we've shown in other work in the boreal forest that these open areas are probably for that nesting resource because they need to lay their eggs on bare ground. What was interesting, though, is that there's quite a contrast in this greenness index between the breeding season and the wintering season. So, we see them switching from non-treat areas during the breeding season to treat areas during the wintering season. And then we see similar selection between fall and spring. So they like green areas on migration as well, but they don't like treat areas as much. They're kind of avoiding water year round, kind of avoiding crops a lot of the year. And then they do seem to be attracted to artificial light at night through most seasons of the annual cycle. Okay, so now we're going to move over to that third objective and define migratory connectivity. So migratory connectivity is essentially the extent to which populations are connected across the annual cycle. And there's a great example of this in Emily Cohen's paper here, where you can see with the rose-breasted grosbeak, populations with high migratory connectivity, the same population that breeds together, winters together, whereas with the green-winged teal, you have different breeding populations, but they're all coming together and mixing together on the wintering grounds. And so we would call that low migratory connectivity. I'm going to speed through this a little bit just so we have enough time at the end for questions. The important thing to know about migratory connectivity is that it essentially tells you how vulnerable a population is to local environmental conditions. If a particular population is staying together the whole year, then they're always vulnerable to the same things. Whereas if they mix together, then the effects on the wintering grounds and migration will be more spread out across the population. And so it's described as a useful first step in evaluating causes of differential population trends among locations. Okay, so here's what you get to see the map of some of the migration routes. So what we found from migratory connectivity is that it's overall low. So we have all these different breeding populations. So post-breeding migration would be your fall migration, pre-breeding would be spring. And you have all these different populations that, like I said, they come due east, they go down the Mississippi Flyway, they go through kind of a bottleneck here oh gosh, I'm losing my countries, in Colombia. And then they kind of spread out, but they all mix together on the wintering grounds, primarily in the Amazon basin and the Cerrado. And then same with pre-breeding migration, they all kind of mix together. They also show this sort of narrow loop migration, which is pretty common in a lot of long distance migrants where they're coming down and then they're taking a more direct route back across the Gulf during spring migration. But we did find a few times and places of the year with elevated migratory connectivity. So these are times of the year when these individual populations might be more vulnerable to local conditions. And so that was during the breeding season, obviously, because they're all in different populations. Pre-breeding migration in late October, especially the timing of it was variable across populations. The non-breeding season, there was some elevated migratory connectivity, but not a ton. And then this pre-breeding migration before the Gulf crossing. So probably a pretty critical time, especially if some individuals are doing these 5,000 kilometer, 3-day nonstop flights. that time in Colombia before they jump off and cross the Gulf is probably pretty important for individual populations. And we did see some migratory connectivity structure there. So then what we did is we took those 4 places of the annual cycle where we see elevated migratory connectivity, and we pulled some pieces of information that we thought represented some of those major threats, some of those major population threats that we talked about earlier. So we looked at cumulative forest growth, we looked at a crop conversion index, and then we also looked at a drought index from 2002 to 2019. And so just really briefly, I'll show you the results of that. And this is work that hasn't been published yet. We can see we've got drought index on the right, forest growth in the middle, crop conversion, or sorry, droughts on the left, crops on the right. And the color suggests how much that variable is associated with positive or negative population trends. And so right now we're looking at the breeding season, and we can see that forest regrowth on the breeding grounds does seem to have negative effects on some populations, as does crop conversion, especially in the West. As we move through to fall migration, then we see that habitat selection piece, a piece of information flip, where actually forest regrowth is having positive effects on some populations. Not a whole lot for crop or drought. On the non-breeding grounds, again, some positive effects of forest growth, again, matching what we've learned about habitat selection. And then we do see some pretty strong negative effects of crop conversion during that spring migration, that critical spring migration period. So notable effects were obviously on the breeding grounds. We're seeing stronger ties to environmental conditions on the breeding grounds, and also that crop conversion variable. Okay, so here's, we'll tie it back to citizen science. So the cool thing is that that analysis was really enabled by being able to tie population trend and to these variables, and that population trend information comes from the citizen science program. So this is was called the Wild Research Nightjar Survey, then it was the Canadian Nightjar Survey. It's now the North American Nightjar Survey, which I had the blessing to steward for over a decade. And that's the data that went into that analysis. And so, here we're answering that question, well, how do we best monitor nightjars? Well, we've kind of answered that question. We went and we compared the breeding bird survey, which is a dawn survey, to the citizen science targeted nocturnal surveys, and asked the question, do dawn point counts work for nighthawks? Here's sort of an earlier version of our survey protocol. And we did this comparison just for Western Canada, because that's where the survey was confined to at the time. But you can kind of see like this probability of detecting a nighthawk on your survey kind of just like drops to the floor at almost exactly dawn. And this red window here is the North American Breeding Bird Survey window for time of day, and then also day of year. Likewise, the blue one is this Canadian Nightjar Survey. And so it also has timing shifted more towards nighthawk breeding season, at least for Canada. And so you can kind of tell why the breeding bird survey may not be the best estimate of precise population trends. And so we also did some simulations to show that your ability to detect a 30% decline, which is that's the sort of threshold that we use for an endangered species, is about 35% with breeding bird survey data and about 70% with this targeted nocturnal or crepuscular survey. We did a simulation of the time because there wasn't enough data, but there's now 15 years of monitoring data in Canada. So this is a figure that Birds Canada shared with me that shows the distribution of the surveys, at least in Canada for the species. There's also 20 years of monitoring data now in the US. And there's also, there's some recent evidence that migration monitoring may also be useful for informing population trend. And so this was a kind of a neat paper that came out in Avian Ecology and Evolution, Avian Conservation and Ecology, excuse me, a couple of years ago about using migration monitoring for trend. So I think the conclusions are that nighthawks are really mobile, which is super cool, but it makes them really hard to study. In terms of conservation, it seems like focusing on populations with high levels of crop conversion, and especially during those stationary seasons, as well as that critical spring migration period, is probably the best place to put efforts. And I think one of the important things to remember is that, just because the bird uses a particular type of environment or a particular type of habitat in one season, the annual cycle, doesn't mean that that carries through to the rest of the season. We're starting to see this in other species as well. And this varying habitat selection is really important to understand and to know because it's really important when linking to potential threats for populations. So if you want to learn more, I mentioned the Global Nightjar Network at the beginning. This is their website there. It's a really cool community of folks who are excited about nightjars. There's a lot of science work involved, but the virtual conference is interdisciplinary. So some years there's presentations about art and nightjars and folklore. And it's a completely free global conference that happens once a year. So I encourage you to check it out. I think it's actually November 2nd to 4th. And then there's also the North American Nightjar Survey, which, Edward, we should talk about getting your data linked up with those guys if you can. So in the US, the survey is, or the website is nightjars.org. In case there are some Canadians in the room, the survey is run by Birds Canada. That's the URL there. And they use the Nature Counts app to do all of their surveys. And so the data gets automatically uploaded into the Nature Counts platform. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the funders of a lot of this work, both for my PhD and for the research itself. And then the work that I've shown today is really the accumulation of like many people's contributions. And so I just want to really emphasize the gratitude for all the folks that have contributed to this, to helping us understand more about the species. And so my favorite way to end a talk is with a picture of a nighthawk to emphasize how cryptic they are. So I will leave it up while we do questions, and you can tell me if you can find the nesting nighthawk.
All right, round of virtual applause for Elly. Thank you so much. Oh, I gotta get my virtual applause in there. There we go. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, so with that said, I know some folks had put some questions in the chat already. I think we're answered along the way, but
Yep.
feel free to ask your questions here. And while we wait for some others to roll in, I had one that I had going along here that I can pop things off with. I'm fascinated by you were showing some of those charts there of the things they gravitate to and the things that they don't. One of the ones that stood out to me was their reticence around water bodies.
Yeah.
That's really strange to me as someone who
Mm-hmm.
assumes that water bodies are
Yeah.
hubs of insect activities. Many breeding insects rely on water as part of their life cycles. What's the theory there?
So the thing I didn't mention with that particular plot is that is technically roosting habitat selection. So we specifically pulled the tags don't necessarily always transmit as well during the day. And so we had them transmitting in the middle of the day when we knew that the birds would be stationary. So I think that's an important lens, like that it is a sort of landscape look at habitat selection, but those are roosting locations. So it may be that they're avoiding water during that particular stage of the day. But I have analyzed that data 6 ways to Sunday, and there's always avoidance of water in it, which is contrary to some of the other work that other folks have done, and certainly in lots of places, especially arid landscapes, like they're definitely foraging over water bodies. So it's a good question. I wish I had a better answer. I'm sorry.
I mean, just shows how much of a mystery is still left to be discovered.
And how variable they are too. Like I think what you said about like the wide ranging piece, like it really is sometimes hard to find the common thread with a species that has such a broad distribution. Okay, it sounds like, oh yeah, Rachel found the nighthawk, so it's here. Christina's asking, slide 7, the insect blob. How many insects are in the clump, or how many can they hold at a time? I mean, there's probably like a half dozen fairly substantial longhorn beetles in that bolus. I would say they can hold like probably about that much at once. I once caught a nighthawk that had a moth probably about this big in its mouth, and it was like with a real chunky body, and it was sticking out of its mouth like kind of like a tiny little cigar. Unfortunately, it dropped it. But I mean, they have these huge mouths. So I think a fair bit. And then Anna was asking, why do they hold them and not eat them immediately? So this is during the breeding season. They're foraging for aerial insects to feed their babies. So this is to bring back to the nest. So they're kind of like jars. Yeah. I could get on board with that. Rachel, has there been any research, correlational studies done on building density, time period built, and the amount of birds? I think I asked Edward this, but just wanted to check with you as well. I know they like urban areas. It would be interesting to get more granular on that. Yeah, so this is one of the tricky ones that I haven't dabbled in because I'm taking a pretty broad perspective on drivers of population trends, but there is a fair bit of debate over how much roof construction approaches have affected populations. So they used to nest when people used to build roofs with gravel rooftops. You would always get nighthawks roosting on those gravel rooftops because it was such a, and it's perfect. Like the eggs blend right in. It's, it drains well. It's exactly what they're looking for. But as roof construction approaches have changed, that nesting location is gone, and so it might be part of what's driving some of those really extreme declines in eastern states. The question is whether the roof construction sort of artificially amplified populations, sort of that would have been there pre-colonial times. I think so. I think it a little bit depends on like what your baseline is, but certainly that idea that the absence of those gravel rooftops is part of what is associated with declines in some populations. There has been some work to try and sort of create like artificial, like little corners of gravel on roofs that I think use some sort of like different membrane. They're not using gravel anymore, so trying to like make a little gravel rooftop. But I think it has been really hard to attract individuals to those areas to get them to nest.
Yeah,
Um,
I just think that
yeah,
isolating like a city like Chicago for like a
yeah,
study like that would be really, really interesting to do.
for sure. Yeah,
I'm a research analyst in market research, so not the same kind of research you do. So this stuff like tickles my research brain quite a lot.
yeah,
So I was like, oh my gosh, we should do like correlational studies on this, you know?
yeah, yeah. And you totally could. I mean, like data science is data science, right?
Right.
Um, you totally could. Like, I don't know if anyone's ever actually done like tried to do the correlation. I think you'd want to be careful about which data you
Yeah, and the
use.
sample size and all that stuff like that.
And I think it would be hard to get the rooftop data is part of why maybe no one's ever done it. Like,
Yeah. Well, I was thinking like I know that people are changing out
mm-hmm,
roofing. Yeah.
mm-hmm,
Um and I don't know and that's there's just so many variables,
yeah,
depicting that. But I was thinking like time period of which they were built.
yeah,
If they've updated it, I was thinking of all
yeah.
these things like this past
You
week
should do it.
about it.
You
Yeah,
should
it'd
do
be
it.
fun. I should.
Because it's there's a lot of places where they've disappeared. Like they used to be in downtown Vancouver. I have heard people talk about them in downtown Vancouver. My favorite Nighthawk paper is from the 50s, where this fellow, this is pre-GPS, he literally like mapped out downtown Detroit on foot twice and then mapped the Nighthawk territories of like the birds nesting
Wow,
on the
I love that.
rooftops in downtown Detroit. It's such a great paper. I wish I could remember the first author right now. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, they used to be in all these major metropolises and they're gone now. And it is probably that rooftop, but I think no one has ever actually done the stats on it. Edward says roofing data is stupid hard to come
Oh my
by.
gosh, I'm sure,
Yeah.
Edward.
And there's probably no satellite imagery good enough from like the right
No, it's
time
real
period to do it
blurry.
either. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not high resolution enough. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, you could still do a correlative probably with some assumptions baked in, but yeah, it's a tricky
Yeah,
one.
one of the things we started exploring and we ran into some hiccups. We
Mm-hmm.
haven't really had to been able to fully see it through, but we were looking at basically can we use some form of either LiDAR or high-res satellite
Yeah,
imagery, and then, because again that those images can't see if it's just like a beige roof or actual rocks,
yeah,
Yeah,
using
you can't really
drones
tell.
to
Yeah.
get in and like
yeah.
verify certain types of images and maybe train a model to identify what is
Mm-hmm.
decidedly a gravel roof versus just like a gravel looking roof.
Yeah.
Again, we didn't get super far into it, but it's certainly something we were talking about just because like
Mm-hmm.
nobody records, like there's no data on that. There's no like GIS data or whatever. Like
Yeah.
we've got so much data for how many trees are in the city or where's the parks
You
or
don't have any data for what
street
kind of
data.
roof they have.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like I guess I get it, right? Nobody, it doesn't really matter to anybody,
Yeah.
but all of a sudden it matters to us and we're like, shoot, where is it?
Hey, what kind
Yeah.
of roof do you have? I don't know.
Yeah.
Some property managers may not know, which is scary, but
Probably. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I suspect the signal would be pretty strong if you could figure out how to do it well. Um, yeah, I don't know of anyone who's ever actually done it. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for engaging in the chat. It's so much more fun to be able to have it be a bit
yeah,
more
thank you
interactive.
so
So
much.
this was really fun. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking your evening to spend it with us here and geeking out about Nighthawks with the whole crew here this evening. And once
Yeah,
again, a
I
virtual round of
appreciate it.
applause for Elly. Thank you so much, and thank you to you guys, the audience, for hanging out with us this evening and having a good time here and geeking out with us. I really appreciate it. And once again, just that final plug. We have a very active volunteer project right here trying to explore and probe further some of the very questions that Elly brought up here today that are still lingering. So if you think you've got a couple nights this summer in June that you could possibly dedicate, we would love to have you on the team to help us continue to try to peel back the questions here. But with that said, thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and we'll see you on another Nighthawk program later this year.